You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World, conversations with researchers and the paths they've taken to help shape our everyday lives. Hello, I'm Rob Webster. I'm an Associate Professor here at the IOE. On this episode, I'm delighted to be talking with Professor Alice Sullivan. Alice is a Professor of Sociology and leads the team responsible for the 1970 British Cohort Study within the IOE's Centre for Longitudinal Studies. Her research interests are focused on social and educational inequalities. Today, we're going to talk to Alice about her research on reading for pleasure. Hello, Alice. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Rob.
Let's start by defining our terms, shall we? So what is reading for pleasure and why is it important?
Reading for pleasure is reading that's really just self-directed. So reading that you're doing because you've chosen to do it and not because somebody else forced you to do it. So it's not homework and it's not work. It's a leisure activity. So it's important, I think, because of the way it's a very, very deep level of engagement with a text. So when you're reading a book, compared to, say, fiddling around on your phone or reading emails or doing bits and pieces, you're really immersed in that text in a very deep way. And you're being exposed to a whole wide range of vocabulary, which is far greater than what you would get from ordinary conversation, for example.
Okay, so it's something to do with being absorbed in the text as well and sort of losing yourself in a book, as we might say.
Yeah, I think that's something that's almost unique about the process of reading for pleasure.
So let's talk a bit about your research on the impacts of reading for pleasure. Your work shows that bright children read more and they do better at English, but they also do better at maths. Now, that might surprise people. Why is that? Is it a confidence thing?
So I think in a way it's not surprising that reading would develop your vocabulary because, of course, reading exposes you to lots of new vocabulary and sentence structures and so on. So, of course, it's going to help your language development. But that then has knock-ons for every other aspect of the curriculum, I think. And people find it surprising it has knock-ons for maths. But, of course, by reading, you're picking up new words, you're picking up new concepts, and you're just better able to access the rest of the curriculum, to understand your maths textbook or to understand the questions that you're being asked. You've just got a better starting point for trying to get hold of any other information that you might be looking for because you can read well.
Right. Okay. So you're just more immediately able to access the textbook or the material that's in front of you. And I suppose that sort of helps a little bit with it frees up bandwidth almost, doesn't it? You can think a bit more perhaps about the maths problem rather than reading the maths problem.
Exactly. I mean, if you imagine a kid that's really struggling with reading, then every single thing they do in another subject is always going to be hitting up against that barrier. What does this word mean? I can't understand this. Whereas if you can read well, then that's just out of the way.
Excellent. So your work also shows that children in lower socio-economic families don't get the same outcomes as their wealthier peers. Tell us a bit about the differences you found between those groups. Is it a big gap?
There are very big gaps in outcomes between socioeconomic groups, and that's, of course, that's not just in my research. That's something that sociologists of education have found since the 1950s, or probably earlier than the 1950s. There's always been big socioeconomic gaps, and in particular, it's down to parents' educational levels. So if your parents are highly educated, then you have a very big advantage in terms of how well you're going to do in your own education. And part of that is about things like having books in the home, having parents who read to their children and who understand how important that is in terms of developing their children's learning.
So they've got the supports at home to nurture and to support that and to value reading for pleasure, I suppose, to even see it as a useful thing.
It's about valuing it, but also possibly about finding it an easy thing to do yourself. I mean, imagine if you have a parent who is struggling with their own poor basic skills, they're going to have a much more difficult time potentially reading a bedtime story or encouraging their children to read.
So I suppose it's about what you see at home and what's modelled at home. If there's good modelling, there's good access, as you say, to books, and you're being read to, that can only help, instill that passion in you as a young child.
Absolutely. So if you've got a house that's full of books and you see your parents reading and your parents take you to the library, then you see that books are important. And so I think one of the most important things that we need to work out is how to bring those resources to those children who don't have them in the home. So it's really important that schools have libraries, for example, because if they don't have libraries, then who's going to suffer the most is the kids that don't have lots of books at home.
So what is it that schools do to develop that passion for reading for pleasure with some of those children who perhaps don't have access to books at home, or they don't have that parental support? What can you give us an example perhaps from some of the schools that you know or that you've worked with where they try to build that passion for reading?
We did an event at a local primary school, which was really wonderful to see that loads of parents and kids came along alongside staff and the school librarian. And it's great to see them really excited and interested in the research findings and using those in order to promote reading for pleasure within the school. And also just amazing to hear about from the school librarian, exactly how she was developing a love of reading, making sure that kids get access to books that they're really going to enjoy reading. I think that's something that not every school has, and it makes a huge difference.
So there's modelling going on. We talked about the importance of modelling inside the home, but there's also modelling at school as well. And as you suggested, having a librarian there or having interested staff who are able to ignite a passion in reading is going to be important for kids who might be missing out at home.
Absolutely. I mean, not every school teacher is going to love reading, but it's really important that you do have school teachers that love reading, that can recommend books that they loved as kids or that they love now. That's so important to instill that passion.
So it takes me to another point about the work that you do. We'll talk about the role and the value of large-scale longitudinal research in just a moment. But perhaps you could tell us, first of all, about what your data show about the long-term effects of reading for pleasure. So what happens as people get older?
As people get older, reading for pleasure is still really important, both the reading for pleasure that they did when they were kids and as adults. So both of those things predict how strong their vocabulary will be in their 40s. We went back to our cohort at the age of 42 and tested their vocabularies and asked them about what they were reading, how much they were reading and what they were reading. So you see this long range impact of their reading when they were youngsters, but it's also really interesting to see that it matters what they read as well as how much they read as adults. So we asked them about what genres they read, so both fact and fiction, and then, what kind of books. So some kinds of books are very popular across the board. So detective fiction, for example, crime fiction, everybody loves regardless of, male, female, or how highly educated they are or not. And then other genres are more kind of stratified, if you like. So we found that the most highly educated people were more likely to read sort of literary fiction and classic fiction. And actually, it was those forms of more demanding fiction that were linked to bigger vocabulary progress gains between the ages of 16 and 42.
Okay, so if I want to improve my vocabulary, I maybe need to put down the trashy airport fiction and pick up something a bit more highbrow, should I?
Yeah, well, don't put down the trashy fiction. Keep your trashy fiction because you love it, and we all read some trashy fiction and it has its place. But if you can expand your parameters and read different things and maybe sometimes read something a bit more highbrow, then yes, you will, of course, be exposed to more different words with that kind of fiction than with your airport thriller.
And have you found any differences in among children as well? So does it make a difference what children read in order to improve their vocabulary?
So unfortunately, we didn't ask them about genres when they were children. And I suppose with children, there isn't quite the same sort of highbrow, lowbrow thing going on. It's more, do you read books or do you read comics and so on? And actually, it definitely was reading books that mattered, not reading other things. Of course, if you were asking kids today, because these were kids born in 1970, you'd probably be asking them about all sorts of other reading, like browsing the internet and so on. My hunch is, I think this is something we need to test, but my hunch is that there is always going to be something special about being immersed in a text, whether you read it as a physical book or a Kindle or whatever, that is different from reading little bits of text online or in any other kind of format.
I was scared that my curiosity was being piqued as you were saying that, because I was going to ask you whether you thought what you read on makes a difference, whether it's printed page or screen. I suppose that's something that you sort of bake into further iterations of the research, is that you can't go back to 1970 and we didn't have
Yeah.
big screens and so on. We often hear that reading for pleasure is in decline, but the benefits of you, as you've explained, are pretty clear. Is reading for pleasure teachable?
It's a really good question. I mean, of course, by definition, you cannot force people to read for pleasure, but I do think it's teachable or at least encourageable in the sense that you can help people. You can model reading for pleasure as we've talked about, and you can read to children when they're young, and you can help them to find the right books and encourage them to have the space to do it as well. I think kids nowadays are so incredibly busy with all the activities that they do and all the homework and so on and so forth. I'm close in age to the 1970 cohort, and obviously you had a lot of time as a kid when you were just bored stiff, and actually maybe there was a value in that because then you do turn to books.
Yeah.
And perhaps, maybe we're all going to kind of rediscover that a little bit in the current crisis with the virus that's keeping us all at home, and lots of people homeschooling their kids and looking for something that their kids can do indoors. Actually, maybe we can turn this around and see a big increase in reading for pleasure.
There's an opportunity here, perhaps. I must ask you about the nature of the large-scale research that you do at the IOE. First, can you tell us about your journey towards doing this type of research?
I did my PhD in sociology at Oxford University, and I was interested in cultural capital, something we call cultural capital, which is about things like reading, but the kinds of cultural activities that some people do that perhaps particularly highly educated people do at home that might actually help them to do well in the education system or help their kids to do well in the education system. So I was interested in that. I went out and did a survey, constructed my own questionnaire and did a survey in schools, and went into 4 schools and got, a pretty decent sized sample, 500 kids, which is quite a lot of data for one person to collect. But then when I left Oxford, I got a job at the Institute as a research officer and started working on these enormous data sets. For example, BCS 70 has started off with about 17,000 people in it, and the same for the 1958 cohort. And of course, we also have the Millennium cohort, children born around 2000. So we have all these birth cohort studies, and I started working on those. There are several advantages, really. One is that you have data on the same people throughout their whole lives so that you can track change in their lives, which obviously is something we exploited within the reading for pleasure work, because there've been a lot of studies that just said, well, yeah, smart kids read more, but they couldn't tell what the change was over time, and the fact that actually the kids that were reading more were actually making bigger gains over time. Another advantage is obviously the sheer scale, the numbers that you have, but also how rich the data is. So you have so many different aspects of people's lives, not just things like reading and education, but also if you wanted to link that to health outcomes, for example, you could, because we know all about their physical health, their mental health, their family circumstances, so many things. So it's just a fantastically rich resource, which researchers from a whole range of disciplines economics, sociology, epidemiology can all use to answer a really wide range of different research questions. And I just want to say a big thank you actually to the cohort members that make it all possible, because we go back to them every few years and make them do these long questionnaires, and they give up their time just, for the science. So that's amazing.
And what's the attrition rate been then? So 1970s, that's what, 50 years now. So
Yeah.
how many did you start with, and how many do you still have in that cohort?
So we started in 1970 with about 17,000 people. And as you say, in 2020, they're going to be turning 50. So it's an amazing milestone for them. And we still have around 10,000 people in the study. Obviously, some people have emigrated, some people have sadly died, and some people will, of course, just decide that they don't want to take part anymore. Some we may have lost over the years. We make great efforts to get in touch with them and to try and track when people move house and so on. There was quite a long period between the ages of 16 and 26 where the study didn't actually have funding to go back to people. And obviously that's quite a crucial age where people are moving around. So we lost some people at that point. But another thing that's amazing is that we keep refinding people through NHS records. For example, we've tracked some people down who haven't taken part for years and years, and are actually really pleased for us to get back in touch with them.
And what did they say about taking part in a cohort study like that? I mean, you mentioned that they see the value in it, and what their own data on their own individual lives, which might be quite unremarkable to them, is contributing to this much kind of broader and richer data set where we can learn about the social world and so on. So do they have any sort of particular insights into what it is to be part of this?
A lot of cohort members have told us that it makes them feel that they are part of something special and something that's bigger than themselves. I think most people do want to be part of something that's bigger than themselves and like the idea of contributing to knowledge. So yeah, it is quite amazing, because when we think that, of course, they were all signed up by their mothers. They were just babies. They didn't choose to do this. As kids, they're obviously, they're doing it because mum tells them to, and then, maybe the teacher encourages them to. But then as adults, they have chosen of their own volition to keep doing it. And they do tell us that they really like hearing about the research stories and the science that comes out of the study.
So they're making a really important contribution, these people, to how we understand the world that we live in, and it's a really interesting document, isn't it? A British life. You mentioned that their experiences and that their data contribute to like health-related research as well as educational research. We're recording this podcast in separate locations because of the worldwide coronavirus health emergency. We've got millions of parents who are supporting their children's learning at home while the schools are closed because of the emergency. So just coming back to reading for pleasure, how can parents encourage reading for pleasure at home at this time?
I think in various ways. So make sure that you have books in the house. Obviously, it's very obvious, and there's so many online resources to find out now, of course, which books you should be reading, much more so than when the 1970 cohort were kids and you just went down the local library and they had what they had, and maybe wasn't very much. So in some ways, we're so much better resourced now. There's so many resources to find out what should kids be reading, and for kids themselves to look up what they should be reading. So in some ways, kind of less excuses than ever, and yet because kids maybe have more distractions or have had more distractions, there has been this decline. I think one particular time that has always been difficult is that transition from the sort of children's books to the teenage books. And I remember kind of making that transition from the kids section of the library to grown-up section, and that can be quite tricky. And that's where I think parents can maybe help children to discover, or teenagers to discover, what books to read next and how to navigate that transition. And, as I say, we all do have a certain amount of time at home now. So it's a good time to be doing it. And also, we've talked about the cognitive advantages in terms of learning of reading for pleasure, but I think there's also something to be said about learning to be on your own and have your own mental resources and not to need constant stimulation. And I think right now is a time when maybe people will start to recognize that more strongly than they have recently.
That's really interesting. It's being forced on all of us, isn't it? I suppose this having this excessive amount of time, and this is all kind of unfolding as spring is unfolding and into summer. So we've got plenty of opportunities to get out into the garden with a good book or a tab or something. So I just wonder, we talked about the differences between screens and printed page. So parents perhaps shouldn't get too concerned if their children are doing a lot of their reading on a tablet or a screen, as long as they are reading. Is that the main thing?
I think that is the main thing. There may well be more research to be done on that, and I think we have looked at the Millennium Cohort as well and found that reading is important for their learning, just as it was for the 1970 cohort. It's been a long time since 2000 now. It's kind of horrifying to think, oh my God, that was 20 years ago. I think both for understanding about the impact of reading on learning and understanding kids' lives in general, I think it is about time that we had a new birth cohort study. There's been a lot of talk about that within the research community, people from different disciplines all very keen to see that. And I think if we had that, this is one of the things that we could look at, the impact of digital. What is it that gets kids reading or not? What are the interventions that might work to stop this decline in reading? And how can we help kids to learn?
And of course, if we were to do another cohort study like that, I suppose it would almost exclusively be, or maybe not exclusive, but it would be largely reliant on technology and on tablets and on apps. And that's something that young people are very familiar with. So they'll be quite happy, I'm sure, to tap away on their phones to advance scientific knowledge for us all. Alice, you've created some online resources to support reading. Tell us what those are and where we can find them.
I've written about this. So one for the Guardian Books blog about how reading for pleasure boosts children's brains, and one for the Conversation website, which is about the findings at age 42 and the way in which reading influenced learning between 16 and 42.
Brilliant. And we'll put those links in the show notes so listeners can follow those up afterwards. Alice, thank you for joining us on the podcast and sharing what you do. Super interesting. You can follow Alice on Twitter at Prof Alice S. You can read about her excellent work too on the IOE website. Just search UCL Centre for Longitudinal Studies. There are more podcasts from the IOE ready for your listening pleasure. Just search IOE podcast on your favourite podcasting app. And you can check out other episodes of Research for the Real World and our playlist of music chosen by our guests and the IOE podcast team. That's on our webpage. Just search Research for the Real World. I'm Rob Webster. Goodbye.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.